So the problem for me, in general, just to step back before we get into the text here, is that I understand Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi better than you understand me and Majid. And I can actually say this with certainty because you are absolutely wrong about me and Majid. And I could ascribe beliefs to al-Baghdadi at random and do a better job than you've done here. I could throw the I Ching and come to a better understanding of his motives than you have come to an understanding of ours by reading and reviewing our book.
The only thing I want to say to that is I think I understand Baghdadi better than you and Majid understand Baghdadi, because I actually factor in to account his political strategy and his geostrategic policy that he's had in Syria and in Iraq that's allowed al-Qaeda in Iraq, the Islamic State in Iraq, to go from being a ragtag group of rebels that was decimated in 2011 to be this very powerful militia in 2016. And that, like, the political factors, and I hope we get to them, those are things that you and Majid don't discuss. I don't see you taking an interest in.
Okay, but that's a totally separate point. I mean, whether you understand Baghdadi better than I do, we can discuss. I'm saying that I understand him, this person who is practically infinitely distant from me on the moral and political and religious and intellectual spectrum, better than you understand me and Majid, and we have told you our motives for writing this book, right? So that's what I find so strange here.
Sam, I don't care about your motives, though. I don't like. For me, it's what the book says, right? And what you said before.
You describe, or what we're going to get into, is because one of the things I'm going to take issue with very early on in your review is your ascription of motives to us. Here is what actually happened there. I made a point about how completely Omer misunderstands my and Majid's motives for writing our book. He did this in his Salon review, in the very opening paragraph. I sought to illustrate this by saying that I understand Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi better than he understands me and Majid. It may have seemed like a hyperbolic example, but it actually isn't. I'm claiming that is literally true. Omer then just changed the subject and claimed that he understands Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi better than either Majid or I do, because we ignore politics and he doesn't. When I pulled him back to the actual topic I had raised, he claimed not to care about our motives in the first place. This is wrong on every conceivable level. Okay, he changed the subject. What he said was just a non sequitur. He then made a claim about my and Majid's ignoring politics, which is itself untrue. It's especially untrue of Majid. His whole focus is on political Islam. And then when I brought him back to the topic, he denied that he cares about our motives at all, okay, which is also totally false. The first paragraph of his essay directly impugns our motives. He claims we wrote our book just to make money. And he had said as much on a previous podcast. Okay, so this is a small masterpiece of deflection and dishonesty, which, yes, many people will not recognize for what it is. Even now, when I perform an autopsy on this moment, many people will not understand what Omer did wrong. In fact, I've already heard from people who listened to that clip on my last podcast who said, he really got you there on politics. He understands al-Baghdadi better than you and Majid do. Okay, these people are destined to love Omer's side of this podcast. But for anyone actually paying attention, you will hear me struggling in vain to keep Omer on topic. He confidently asserts points, like the point about al-Baghdadi you just heard, that are non sequiturs. Sometimes I follow him down that rabbit hole, and we wind up discussing these topics, and sometimes I don't. And when I don't, I am sure his audience will interpret that as my having conceded the irrelevant point he just raised. But as you'll hear all too clearly in places, I found the resulting conversation deeply frustrating. Okay, if there is anything in this podcast that embarrasses me, it's just how annoyed I let myself get, and very early on, merely having a conversation with another human being. Okay, and not to demonize Omer, I think that most of this behavior on his part is probably unconscious. Most of the time he's going off point and being effectively evasive. I don't think he even knows what he's doing. He's very articulate, and he has these chunks of language on the hard drive he wants to download. But the true things he says are usually irrelevant, and the relevant things he says are usually false. And that is a toxic combination, okay, especially for me. I mean, that is my kryptonite. Okay, so you will hear me at my least patient, and I'm not proud of who I was in those moments. And you will also hear a fair amount of despair from me at points. This is not the despair of someone who was worried he was losing a debate. Now, on the contrary, if you want to view this as a debate, there are several moments where I appear to win it outright by full knockout. True to form, Omer didn't realize he had been knocked out, but you will. I wasn't trying to have a debate. I was trying to have a truly honest conversation. And the despair you hear, especially at the end, was over the discovery that this just wasn't possible. But here's what you will not find in this podcast. You will not find any of the things that Omer says you would find there. Virtually every word in his recap of our conversation on Salon is a lie. He claims that I said things I didn't say. He read into my silences other things I don't believe and would never say. He claims to have demonstrated my ignorance on topics about which I'm not ignorant, and which were among the many irrelevant points he raised and we barely touched. But most incredible of all, he said that somewhere in this conversation you are about to hear, I, quote, demonized Muslims to such an extreme degree that it verged on bloodlust, and that I communicated in some way that, quote, Muslim-looking or brown-skinned bodies were of no human value to me. Now, I don't know how he thought he could get away with that. Okay, the man, and he is a man, he's not a teenager. He's a journalist in his 20s getting his law degree at one of the best law schools on earth. Okay, he's published in the New Republic and the New York Times. He's an adult, and he is attempting to destroy my reputation by alleging that I said things I didn't say in a conversation that was recorded. Okay, and I have the recording, which I can choose to release, as I'm doing now. And he did this so that I would release it. What on earth was he thinking? Well, I'll tell you what I think he's thinking. I think Omer understands that he is writing primarily for an audience that does not care whether or not he is honest. They just want to see the people they disagree with demonized. And this is the audience that Glenn Greenwald writes for, and Chris Hedges, and Reza Aslan. And I'm afraid Omer is right. But that's not my audience. Okay? And when you guys tell me that I've done something that makes me look less than honest, that matters to me. A lot. And what's more, it quite obviously matters to you. I'm often charged by people like Glenn Greenwald with having a cult of followers who just agree with everything I say. As far as I can tell, your tolerance for me appearing to be intellectually dishonest is non-existent. And I wouldn't have it any other way. And the fact that so many of you thought it looked shady for me not to release the full podcast, that really bothered me. So here it is. Now, as you might imagine, I've elected not to spend the $500 to $1,000 it would have cost me to clean up all the breaths and mouth noises. We've edited out all the big Skype glitches and bathroom breaks and coughing fits. And there were many moments when Omer and I were talking over one another, which on Skype just becomes a total mess and you can barely understand what's being said. And the same thing winds up being said a moment later once one person just stops trying to interrupt the other. So, in the interest of preserving your sanity and your hearing, we cut those bits as well. But, just to be clear, every meaningful sentence of our conversation has been preserved. And now, for better or worse, I give you Omer Aziz.